Good evening and welcome to After Hours. I'm really pleased and happy that the woman is joining me today, coordinator of PACE. Welcome to the show, Brenna Bezanson. I like that name.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So PACE has been around for about 20 years.
Yeah, 22.
22 years,
yeah.
Okay. Talk a bit about the history and what changes briefly it's gone through.
Oh, wow. So PACE in 22 years, just due to funding and also different capacities, has gone through quite a few different incarnations. Right now, I would say that we're probably the most stable that we've ever been, although we could always use more funding
Right.
to do the work that we do. PACE started in a one-bedroom apartment, and it was a group of sex workers and allies that acknowledged that support for sex workers was best served when it was being provided by experiential people, actual sex workers themselves. At this point, we have a full drop-in with quite a comprehensive and holistic set of services that we provide. And all of those services are actually determined by the voices of our members. So folks that access services at PACE become members of the organization itself and have a voice in what services we provide.
Okay, so what was the atmosphere when it first started that would have initiated that?
So as we know, Vancouver has, the history of Vancouver, in the 90s, when PACE was founded, we saw one of the greatest not one of the greatest tragedies, but a huge tragedy in the 90s with the missing and murdered women in Vancouver. So in the 90s, people were going missing, and we were all trying to figure out, what to do. I wasn't on the scene at the time, but people in the community were trying to figure out how to prevent that and how to come together as a community and keep each other safe. So over the years, we have, worked together as a community to rally for, better rights, and that's given us the capacity to be more vocal and active as an organization, which has taken us from really just being in, survival mode to actually, providing services to help people thrive.
Sort of looking for the future, planning for the
being
future.
More proactive as opposed to at that time where I feel like it was a very reactive time. There were, we all knew that people were going missing, or the community certainly knew that people were going missing, and we needed to do something about that. Whereas now, the work is to prevent such tragedies from happening and building people's self-esteem and skill sets so that we don't see a repeat of that history.
And I have a memory of, in the West End, there being backlash against women who worked on the streets. Absolutely. And that was was that happening kind of at the same time?
So the West End sex workers were moved out of the West End in, I believe it was in the 80s. So we've just actually, Jamie Lee Hamilton, a local activist, has quite courageously, worked with the city to actually organize a memorial to the West End sex workers. So a bit of a victory for the cause, although that's her victory, not ours.
Right.
Yeah.
So you were saying, okay, your organization, it's all, the members are sex workers, so it's peers working together. How is that different maybe, and we were talking earlier about consensus. How does what makes that different in the organization in terms of some organizations?
So as an organization, we, not only do we prioritize hiring people with lived experience, not all of our staff are sex workers, although we prioritize always keeping a majority. of the staff as experiential workers. And we also do consensus decision making so that it's not just the people in power in the organization that have a say in the programming. So from frontline staff all the way up to management, we meet every Friday and make organizational decisions. And then folks that access services become members of the organization and have voting rights at our AGM, are able to vote in the board, and then all of our programming is based on the needs that they've expressed to us.
That's pretty amazing, and it must be a long process. Although you must have it down
Yeah.
pat by now, at this point, sort of.
I think we have it as down pat as anyone could. Sometimes it feels a little bit like reinventing the wheel, but you know, I think when it comes to support services, if you are running an organization where the stakeholders have no say in how you're supporting them, then the wheel's broken.
Yeah.
And so it's worthwhile to reinvent it.
Keep it going in
Yeah.
whatever different
Yeah.
directions. Okay, now we're using sex workers, but that could mean a whole bunch of things. So what is PACE's, not necessarily definition, but who does that include? Or does it exclude anybody?
So we have a fairly inclusive definition of sex work. We see sex work as any erotic companionship or sexual service in exchange for money or basic needs. So that can be offering companionship for a place to stay for the night. That can be erotic dancers, that can be cam girls, and that can be street-based sex workers. And we support current and former sex workers. So a person doesn't have to actively be doing the work to experience the stigma that comes with having done the work at one point in their life. So we still provide support to folks whether they're currently working or not.
And is it a female-based situation? Is it for women only, or do you participate or have contacts in?
So we offer our services to anybody that is a self-identified sex worker, regardless of their gender. We do see mostly female-identified sex workers, inclusive of trans people. There is a really great organization in Vancouver called Hustle that provides services to male sex workers, and as they are the experts in reaching the male sex worker community, we try to provide referrals to them as much as possible. But if somebody would prefer to come to us, we're certainly happy to help them, and do. Yeah.
So what is the difference, and we talked about this earlier, so I want to get into this a bit more, because we have such a thing about whether we call it prostitutes, the sex trade, sex workers. What is the difference, or what in our culture, in our society is the difference? Because there are sex therapists. So what's the difference between the sex therapist and a sex worker? Because I do know that there are sex workers who work with handicapped people,
Yes.
etc. Talk a bit about that.
I think sex work is a broad term for, as I said, erotic, sexual or companionship services. So I think that is sort of the broad umbrella where services like sex therapists or erotic dancers or cam girls or street-based sex workers all fall under that umbrella. Prostitute, I think there's a lot of stigma attached to that term.
Yes.
And that term is actually at this point really predominantly used by the law, although many sex workers are reclaiming that term as a term of power for themselves. The reason why we like the term sex work, or why many sex workers like the term sex work, is it legitimizes it as a form of income generation and labor, that it is work, as opposed to the many different judgments that people have on, what they think the reality of sex work is.
Why do you think, I mean, you've dealt with this for a long time, you meet the women, the people involved. Why is it we don't see it as work, like garment factory workers? Talk a bit about that. I honestly, even though we use sex to sell things on billboards, go ahead.
I think misogyny, to be really honest with you, and not to get too political. And I think it really comes down to the fact that we, as a society, police women's bodies in such a way that when a woman takes agency over her body, that we as a society need to believe that she's been coerced into that. It's this narrative of predator and prey that that we thrust upon any situation where a woman is practicing her own agency. I think that it comes down to the fact that it is a woman having sex that makes us uncomfortable, because we don't have that same conversation about men in sex work. In fact, we're really, as a society, not very concerned about them. And I think that that's pretty telling to how much misogyny is wrapped up in this. That we have to believe that a woman doing sex work must be coerced into doing it or is being forced into it. Whereas when men do it, we just really don't care or don't think about it. Or
maybe don't see them as victims.
For the most part, what we thrust upon them is still a form of shame, but it's predominantly homophobia and gay shame. Right. But that's the part that people are really upset about and concerned about is, the fact that it's two men meeting up. We also, as a society, when it comes to marginalized people, almost assume that they're engaging in sex work, whereas we require a huge amount of evidence in order to even believe that a man would be doing the work, which I think also, just speaks to how much we police and monitor women's bodies.
Right. But there are victims.
Absolutely. And I think,
And I think of young people in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we also have to realize that, 1 in 4 women in Canadian society will be, sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And most of those people are sexually assaulted at a young age. And that's in any population, in any career path. Most of those people don't become sex workers. Does child exploitation exist? Absolutely. It exists in many industries, including the garment industry. When that happens, we look to labor laws and labor rights as a solution. When we hear about that in sex work, we look at, prohibition as a solution, and the villainizing of an entire industry of people, most of whom are adults, and most of whom are consensual, are there consensually. And we have really adequate laws for child exploitation. But this narrative of everybody in the industry being forced distracts us from initiatives that would be effective in helping young people that might not want to be there.
It's interesting because this is a long time ago, and I did a roundtable discussion with some women and Marie Arrington. And it was a surprise, not a surprise, but it took me a little bit aback, even though I had dealt with sex worker issues. And my coworkers very much back, and in particular men aback. And one of the reasons was, it wasn't like I expected the victim narrative, and it was a working narrative, what they did for their work. And anyway, I'm not sure what I'm saying, it's just saying it was very much work involved. And part of the surprise, I think, for the men in the room was the exposure of their sexuality. Maybe if you can. Is that part of the fear in people?
Well, I think it really does come down to, that, as you said, we use sex to sell just about everything, but we punish women when they're, when they take control over their own sexuality.
Yes.
Always. In our society, we punish strong women for taking their own agency in any space. So it's not surprising to me that we as a society, when we see a woman profiting, creating profit for herself, and then also being, taking control over her own sexuality, both of those are really scary things for us as a society. So it's not surprising to me that, when both of those things exist in the same, space, that we would be threatened by it. I think that comes down to, our own misconceptions about, women's agency. I also think, like you brought up the youth in sex work. Right. There's a statistic that's often plugged and has been for a few years now of the average age of entry being around 13, I believe. And this is a statistic that anybody watching this and then Googling it would most likely come up with. The Washington Post actually tracked down the source of that statistic. And even the researchers themselves that did that study acknowledged that it was pretty biased. They only studied youth, so surprise, if you're only looking at youth, of course you're going to have an average age of entry being youth. It wasn't peer reviewed. There really is very little evidence to support, there being a crisis of that in the industry.
Now, PACE uses a harm reduction model. Talk a bit about that. What does that mean to PACE?
Well, I think it comes down to meeting people where they're at and allowing them to do whatever it is that they're going to do in the safest way possible, without judgment. So when we say that we take a harm reduction approach, it really comes down to allowing a person to come to us and tell us, honestly, where they're at, what they're doing, and then offering them options for how they can do that safely and allowing them to take the lead from there. We also have an asset-based approach, which I think often when I say asset-based, it's misunderstood. What I mean is that when a person comes to us with a goal, we look at where they're at. We look at the skills and the strengths that they already have, their situation, and then we build upon that to get them to that goal, as opposed to creating unrealistic standards. If a person comes to you and their goal is to leave sex work for mainstream work, we absolutely are supportive of that if that's their goal. But if they're homeless, well, then we need to get that, then we need to work on that with them. Mm-hmm. If they are struggling with substance use, then we need to help them stabilize that first in order to get them to that goal of, mainstream employment. And that can take years.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's change for any human being who wants
Absolutely.
to make whatever change.
And especially in a society that has set up so many barriers for marginalized people, that getting them past each of those barriers towards a place of stability where they can achieve those goals, we have an entire system working against them.
Right. They're the hidden. I think it's getting more and more
mm-hmm.
public and more in the mainstream, but for very long I think it's been quite hidden.
Absolutely. And I think, it's not surprising that, especially in street-based sex work where, although it makes up only about 10 to 15% of sex workers, is the most vulnerable group of sex workers. I don't think it's shocking to find out that that's actually, predominantly overrepresented by marginalized groups, that, that's racialized people, that's Indigenous folks that are overrepresented in street-based sex work, that's trans people that are overrepresented in street-based sex work.
Right. There must be a lot of one-to-one work. If you have an individual or individuals coming in, there must be a lot of one-to-one work.
So we have an amazing support worker on our team who does, her name's Kenzie, and she does one-to-one support work. And that is everything from one-to-one goal planning, that is advocacy. We also have specific programs for trans people where she walks them through getting proper identification, which reduces their barriers to accessing other services. And then we do have groups as well. So we have our violence prevention workshop, which is an occupational health and safety course for sex workers. We have our Aboriginal Sharing Circle, which is run by our 2 Aboriginal outreach workers. We have our Wise Women group, which is for folks that are 40 and older. And then we have street-based outreach and peer health navigation, which is outreach in the hospitals.
Okay, and what about going directly to the streets?
So our 2 outreach workers are out on the streets twice a week. And it's really just about relationship building, about building trust with community members so that if and when they do decide that they need some support, that they know that there's a safe place to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So talk about the safety workshop that you do. If it's called a safety workshop, that's the violence prevention. Talk a bit about that.
So our violence prevention workshop is run by Sherry Kisselback. Sherry has been running this program for about 10 years at PACE. And it's a holistic approach to violence prevention. So what we know is that if people are suffering from low self-esteem, that they're less likely to get themselves out of a dangerous situation. So we start with self-esteem and build up their sense of self-worth. It's an 8-week course, so they're also there with the same people for 8 weeks, so we help build community with them. And then we go into understanding their rights. The Vancouver Police Department comes in and does a workshop with the members on reasonable force and the current laws. And then the last day of the course, which is really exciting, is a self-defense course with the Vancouver Police Department. So we set up mats in the drop-in space, and you know, the members get to, you know, fight with police officers. Essentially.
That's not so bad, eh?
You know, and learn how to defend themselves. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's quite an exciting time, and we see all the time how, you know, how this course really changes people's lives, and it also brings them into PACE where they can find a sense of community and just
be part of something too as well.
Safe space where they're not going to be misunderstood or judged, which for sex workers is rare.
So you must obviously have a good relationship with the Vancouver Police Department. How has it changed, or have you seen changes? Has PACE seen changes?
I think the Vancouver Police Department has had a really progressive approach with sex work. They have a sex work liaison with the Vancouver Police Department named Linda Malcolm, and she's sort of an officer and a social worker all at the same time. And many of the sex workers know her name, they know her cell phone number, and she's been a huge ally for us, just in terms of working with us to support our members. The Vancouver Police Department has also indicated that when it comes to enforcing laws around sex work, the safety of sex workers is their first priority. So they will deal with enforcement of, if there's an altercation that involves a sex worker, they will deal with the actual crime. So if it's an assault, they'll deal with the assault and leave the sex work portion of it alone, to, you know, honor her agency and her privacy in that scenario.
So talk a bit about the healing circle, did you call it, for the Aboriginal?
The Aboriginal Sharing Circle.
Yeah, and what you do with Aboriginal women.
So our outreach workers, Chantel and Gina, provide that program, and it's educational, community building, and sometimes just fun activities. So it's one of our more popular groups. Because we do know that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in street-based sex work. that can look like from one week to the next. It can be a guest speaker to teach the folks about specific topic. Last week we had the Vancouver Public Library came in to talk about the memorial quilt for the missing and murdered women. Oh, wow. Other weeks it's fun activities where they'll all get together and do crafts for the day. And other days it's just about community building and going out to different art galleries if they're having specific Aboriginal exhibits, and yeah.
Well, how many members do you have? Because it sounds like a lot of activities are happening, and
yeah.
About how many members would you say you have?
So at this time, I believe, it's been a while since I've checked the database, so I'm probably going to give you the statistic and get back from my executive director. I believe it's about 400 people that we have in our database on our membership.
Because it sounds like it's...
And that's not to say that those people visit us all the time.
Yeah, come and go.
But that's members that could access services at any time.
Okay, because it sounds like it's, I don't know if the right phrase is a going concern. It's something important and valuable to the people involved, that it would be
I think,
and well used.
Well, I think what it comes down to is that for sex workers, there are very few spaces where they're going to be understood and accepted and not be judged. Right. When I came to PACE 4 years ago as a member accessing services, it was because I was seeing another counselor who acknowledged that he had no idea how to wrap his head around supporting me with some of the issues that I was having around my sex work. So he referred me to PACE because he acknowledged that he wasn't doing a great job and wanted to send me somewhere where somebody would.
That's good, though.
And it was a space where I didn't have to explain in order to have a discussion, where I didn't have to give a whole bunch of context of this happened, this is why this happened. I could just talk to the counselor and she would understand where I was coming from.
That's nice.
And that at that time in my life was a rare gift. And I think,
yes,
I work for PACE, so I'm a little bit biased, but I think in terms of the services that are available for sex workers, I think we're a bit of a rare gift.
Okay, we're really quickly running out of time, but PACE is having open house, is that what you'd call it?
So on December 17th, which is International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, we're having a day of education at PACE Society. It's a community event, so anybody that wants to come and learn is welcome to come. We will have guest speakers from politicians to academics to community members sharing their narratives. So I think it's going to be a really great day. And then at the end of it all, FIRST, which is another sex worker organization, is having a march, which will be starting at PACE and going out into the community.
How can people find out about the event?
So our Facebook does have a event page. There's also a link to the event on the homepage of our website. If you go to pace-society.org. We'd love to see anybody and everyone who wants to just come together, support sex workers, and learn learn about the things that you don't know. I'm looking forward to learning because there's certainly still a lot for me to learn.
Thank you so much for doing this.